Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the TrueSight Operations Management version 11.0 overview. For your information, today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to hand the call over to Ellen Coleman. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Alex. Hello all, and thank you for joining this session for the TrueSight version 11 Best Practices webinar series. In this session, we will be discussing the basic overview of best practices of key features and capabilities in the TrueSight Operations Management version 11. This session is intended for people who implement and administer TrueSight Operations Management, and we will learn how to start taking advantage of the improved features and capabilities in the new version 11. At this time, I'd like to hand the meeting over to Hudson Meeks.
Thank you very much, Ellen.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And thank you, everybody, for attending, or if you're watching this after it's been recorded, we very much appreciate your attention to this information and hope that you find it very useful. This best practice session is very much like the ones that you may have attended in the past for previous versions. It's really focused more on first level training, and it's focused on generally on best practice, meaning what you should do in certain situations where you have options and choices, things to look out for, things to do, things not to do, tips, that kind of stuff. It's not detailed how to actually go through the individual steps of installing the product and various things like that. Although in some of these sessions we do cover that kind of material where we think it's appropriate to provide additional clarification that may not be in the documentation or places where people tend to stumble and so forth. It's more focused on core TrueSight Operations Management components, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail on TrueSight capacity optimization as an example, okay? We can't possibly address every scenario in these sessions. As you may know if you've been working with the product, which hopefully you have been, the product is very, very flexible and has a lot of different pieces and a lot of power and capability to it. So it doesn't really, we can't possibly go into every single scenario in these sessions. We focus on the ones that we see the most in the field and that customers need the most help with and so forth. Certainly prior knowledge of the components and terminology regarding the product suite on your part is very beneficial for you, but if you're brand new to the product, there's nothing wrong with you continuing to watch this session, and you should be able to get quite a bit of information out of it because we're going to go through some things that are fairly basic and so forth. Now this session, and this doesn't really apply to every one of the sessions that we do, but this one is quite, there's quite an expectation here that you do have some prior knowledge because this session's more focused on the new capabilities in TrueSight 11 that extend beyond previous versions like TrueSight 10.7 versus 10.5 and so forth. So certainly, previous knowledge and experience with the product is going to be very helpful for this. But again, if you're not in that state and you're brand new to the product, there's certainly nothing wrong with you using this as a starting point. Okay. Our agenda today, we're going to cover kind of an overall process of installing and implementing the product. We're going to go over the overall architecture. We'll have another session later on that goes into more depth about the architecture and scalability. So this is kind of an overview of the architecture and what's changed, especially with TrueSight 11. Operating system compatibility there, we're going to hit on some points with that. We're also going to talk a little bit about some dropped features so that you're aware of features that have been dropped. There's going to be a bit of a discussion about install and upgrade. Again, with install and upgrade, this is not an in-depth discussion about installing and upgrading the product. We'll have another session on that topic later. This is more focused on what's new regarding install and upgrade and some best practice, tips and so forth there. Same concept around data monitoring enhancements. There's a new licensed usage type reports in the product that we'll go over and provide some best practice and tips on those as well. And we'll continue on with some security improvements and wrap up with usability improvements. Okay, so the overall process, and this hasn't changed at all from previous releases, we strongly encourage you to resist the temptation to immediately install software. Instead, understand what your business needs are first. What are your business needs and your business requirements as well as the technical requirements? There's a lot of features and capability in TrueSight Operations Management, and you may not need all of them. And/or you may decide that certain ones need to be implemented in your environment ahead of other ones and so forth. So understand what your immediate and most, prioritized business needs are before you ever start doing anything like installing software and so forth. Also, if you're doing an upgrade, understand old and new solution capabilities and features. That's a big part of what this session's about today. You do not have to install the product to get started or oriented. A lot of us who are very technical and so forth, we want to get our hands on the product and install it as soon as we can, start playing around with it and work with it. We encourage you to do that. That's fine, but don't start making decisions until you understand all the capabilities, features, and how the product works and have reviewed some of these best practice sessions. Decide what specific features are required and plan to implement them only where needed. So, for example, the entire stack can support SSL certificates and security communications between the different components, but that doesn't mean you have to implement that up and down the entire stack. As an example, the data collectors, which are patrol agents, can communicate via TLS up to what we call the integration service nodes, and that could be thousands of agents communicating like that. And then there's upper tier components such as the integration service nodes and server components and so forth that also support secure communications between those various components that may be distributed in the environment, okay? If you implement security, you don't have to do an all or none approach. So I've worked with some customers, I know other folks have as well, where they set up security at the upper level for users logging in and all that kind of stuff, and between the security configured between the different server components, but not necessarily the entire rest of the stack. So understand where you need it and where you don't need it, and don't create additional work for yourself where it's unneeded. And that's just one example of that. Again, prioritize your business needs and solution capabilities. Determine sizing and architecture. Definitely you need to do that before you go and install it in production. In a development or test play environment, you don't necessarily have to go through those steps, but you should be looking at that, very early in the process. And also plan to implement or upgrade in phases. So, don't think that you're going to go install all of these components all at one time in one big bang. It's usually not possible to do that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the architecture. The overall architecture for TrueSight Operations Management and Infrastructure Management, we'll get this slide actually is labeled incorrectly, so I apologize for that. This is the overall architecture for the entire stack, okay? So at the top, we have the presentation server. And below that, we've got these major capabilities that have their corresponding server components that support these capabilities. So there's a real user analyzer from a transaction and application transaction perspective. There's an app visibility server as well that helps support monitoring transactions, including synthetic transactions from an application perspective. Then there's the ITDA analytics server, which is able to collect data from many different sources, including log files, syslog, and various other sources, and organize and index that data and provide searching capabilities, and does lots of other things as well with that data to help you quickly and easily find faults associated with, degradation of an application or whatever. And then there's the infrastructure management server and its corresponding components under that for collecting and trending data such as CPU, memory, disk, and all those kinds of things that are, we've done in this industry for a long time from a monitoring perspective. So this architecture that I've described here is very, very high-level architecture. And again, you don't have to implement every one of these capabilities and their corresponding components. You basically pick and choose what's appropriate for your environment, and we can integrate to other solutions as well where appropriate. This hasn't really changed with TrueSight 11, except with Remedy single sign-on. This used to be Atrium single sign-on. We have replaced Atrium single sign-on with Remedy single sign-on. So let's talk about Remedy single sign-on and what that might mean to you. And this may be very helpful for folks who have been working with the product already. So first of all, Remedy single sign-on completely replaces Atrium SSO or Atrium single sign-on. Atrium single sign-on is not supported with TrueSight 11, and it cannot be used at the same time with TrueSight 11 along with Remedy SSO. Now, don't fall out of your chair. We have a way of handling this, and it's quite slick, actually. It's really smooth. Remedy SSO must be installed and completely configured before you install the rest of the components or upgrade an existing TrueSight Operations Management stack. So it needs to be installed on its own server somewhere in the environment and available and ready to go before you do an install of all the other components or doing an upgrade of any of the other components. Okay. Internal users that you may have created in Atrium SSO can be migrated out of Atrium SSO and into Remedy SSO. Now, most customers don't use it that way, or they may use it that way to a limited extent. Most of your users are configured typically in an LDAP integration to Atrium SSO or Remedy SSO, okay, LDAP or Active Directory. The users and groups there are not migrated. So if you're upgrading from Atrium SSO and moving to the TrueSight 11 environment, thereby replacing Atrium SSO, you've got to have Remedy SSO set up and configured with the corresponding LDAP users and groups and have that ready to go before you actually do your upgrade. And that is going to be a manual process. But for most customers, there's not a whole lot of user stores and things like that that are configured. The manual work and setting that up ahead of time is really just not that much work. And generally what you can do is look at how you've got Atrium SSO configured and make sure that you configure Remedy SSO the same way, and then possibly add some additional users and so forth if it's appropriate. Okay. The good news here is that the upgrade of the TrueSight presentation server, say from either 10.5 or 10.7 to version 11, it supports a seamless switch from Atrium SSO to Remedy SSO, assuming that you've already got Remedy SSO configured like I've been talking about. Okay. So the way it works is when you're doing the upgrade install, you're just running the quote installer for the presentation server and upgrading it to 11. There's a point in the process where the wizard will ask you for the information regarding Remedy SSO. And as the process completes, it just switches the upgraded server over to the new authentication environment of Remedy SSO and removes its connections and so forth to Atrium SSO. Remedy SSO does support high availability, okay? And also be aware that, again, you don't have to do everything all at one time. You can do things in phases. So you could upgrade your presentation server maybe in a 10.7 or 10.5 environment to version 11 with Remedy SSO, and the TSOM servers in that environment may remain at 10.7 or 10.5 for some period of time until you're ready to upgrade them. Okay, so you can do the presentation server first and then come back later, weeks later, or whenever it's appropriate, and do the TSOM servers as well. So you're not forced into an all, big bang upgrade all at one time. Version compatibility is very important here. I'm talking about version compatibility of Remedy SSO. Version 9103.001, patch 001, is the version that we support, and it's the first version that we support with TrueSight Operations Management 11. And this is important if you're in a Remedy environment that is also using Remedy SSO, and you want to utilize the same Remedy SSO environment with TrueSight 11 that you're also using with Remedy. Okay, you need to make sure that it's upgraded to at least this version. Okay, so now this isn't intended to be an in-depth conversation on Remedy SSO, but because it's new to folks who may be upgrading to 11 here, I thought it would be appropriate to go into some requirements and a little bit of architecture information about Remedy SSO. Again, it must be installed before Remedy. Excuse me, there are certain components that must be installed and available for you to be able to install Remedy SSO. Okay, so this is a list of the supported browsers. Be aware of the different versions that we're supporting there. Now, these are the ones that are officially tested and so forth. Okay, we do not install Tomcat with the product. You have to install Tomcat yourself. Use the latest stable version of Tomcat Server 7 or 8. Stable meaning, you know, patches and whatnot to address any kinds of security issues and things like that. Also configure Tomcat so that the Tomcat version is not displayed. It's basically a recommendation there from a security perspective. Both of these points under Tomcat are security recommendations. Okay. Remedy SSO leverages a database. It can utilize SQL Server, Oracle, or Postgres, the versions that you see listed here. Okay. If you decide to use Microsoft SQL Server, it's accessible through TCP and not named pipes, so do not use named pipes. Okay. Configure it so the SQL Server authentication is utilized and you're not using the integrated Windows authentication, which is another authentication mechanism that you can use with Microsoft SQL Server. So again, use SQL Server authentication and not the integrated Windows authentication. It also does support SQL Server's always-on configuration database cluster type setup, okay? And the same is true for Remedy, but you have to be on version 9.1.01 to support Remedy there. And keep in mind the version that we mentioned here regarding support for TrueSight. Just a very quick overview on the Remedy SSO components, kind of from an architecture perspective. There's a Remedy SSO agent. You can have multiple agents in the environment. It basically protects resources from unauthenticated logins. It's the component that actually does that. All unauthenticated requests will be redirected to the Remedy SSO server, okay, instead of allowing login. And it defines domain users depending on their domain. So if you have, multiple users in different domains and so forth, the Remedy SSO agent handles those different domain users' requests and so forth. And it controls which Remedy SSO server is used in a multi-server environment. Then, of course, there's the Remedy SSO web application. It obviously handles the validation requests from agents and authenticates the users into whatever systems they're, trying to log into and so forth. And it supports SAML version 2 and Remedy AR system authentication mechanisms. Okay. The rest of this is Remedy related. I'm not going to talk about it. I just threw it on this slide so that you would be aware of it and understand how it authenticates into Remedy, because you might be working in an environment where you're integrating to Remedy with TrueSight, and at the same time you're integrating into TrueSight as well. And one Remedy SSO implementation is supporting both platforms for your authentication. Now let's talk a little bit about the high-level architecture for these different capabilities, these major capabilities that you saw earlier that report into the presentation server. The infrastructure management stack, its architecture is basically not changed. It's unchanged. You have patrol agents and knowledge modules down here that are monitoring things like operating system metrics, application metrics, maybe the amount of heap, doing things like availability monitoring, ping monitoring, and so forth, and all the different things that we monitor with KMs, databases, various application platforms, operating systems, middleware, all kinds of stuff there, okay? They still report their data and events up into what we call an integration service. and there can be multiple nodes for those in a very large environment, and then that data is reported up into the infrastructure management server that handles things like baselines, predictive alarming, probable cause analysis, those kinds of things. And then ultimately all the data and events and so forth that we're processing and generating is presented in the presentation server, which is the primary point where users log in and see the data. Okay, the app visibility components that are used to monitor application transactions, those could be synthetic transactions, and or they could be what we call app visibility data, where we drop an agent. It could be a Java agent or a .NET agent is loaded up into the corresponding application that you want to monitor. All of this remains the same as it was in the previous releases from a high-level architecture perspective. The agents basically report their data up into the app visibility server or portal through this app visibility collector. Some of these components can be distributed. Actually, all these components can be distributed here. You may or may not be using a proxy with this. What's not shown on this slide is what we call the TEA agent, which is the component that does the synthetic monitoring, and it reports its data in a similar fashion into the stack here. Basically, all of that remains as it was in the previous release of 10.7. Okay, the only change here is that we're relying on Remedy SSO just like we do for the rest of the stack. Okay, IT data analytics. The only thing that I wanted to point out here is number one, it's pretty much unchanged. The only thing to be aware of is in previous releases we made a direct connection over to Atrium single sign-on. That's now replaced with Remedy single sign-on. So you may or may not implement ITDA. We'd certainly like for you to implement ITDA, and you can get a tremendous amount of benefit by doing so, because we can bring all of this data together in one stack, in one solution, and it's all integrated and so forth, and visible and actionable up through the presentation server. But just be aware that if you're implementing the latest release of ITDA, which is version 11, it's going to be relying upon Remedy single sign-on, and is not supported with Atrium single sign-on anymore. So just be aware of that. Additionally, the end user experience management, EUEM as we affectionately call it, it's basically unchanged. Okay, except for, of course, access to it through the presentation server and so forth is managed by Remedy single sign-on instead of Atrium SSO. And really these components that don't make a direct connection to the authentication stack, the single sign-on component, such as EUEM here, they don't really care that this has been changed to Remedy SSO from Atrium SSO. It's totally transparent to them. It really has no impact on them. So, to say that the architecture is basically unchanged here and the way that we're processing data at a high level and so forth is unchanged is a fact, and it's not really, you're not really concerned about having changed Remedy up here and then having to worry about some kind of change down here. Okay. Just a very quick blurb, and I'm not going to spend hardly any time on capacity optimization, but just be aware that it, like the other components, version 11 does no longer support Atrium SSO. Atrium SSO is unsupported with it, and you're leveraging Remedy SSO instead of Atrium SSO there. There are some new components and features that have been added, and it's pretty significant with the capacity optimization. And that would be an entire another session to go through those features and discuss all of that. Also be aware that some features and platforms have also been dropped. And this information is all very readily available in the product documentation. So if you have an immediate need to understand this, you know, what's new in TrueSight Capacity Optimization version 11, and you're planning on some kind of an upgrade, I would recommend strongly that you, you know, leverage the product documentation and/or leverage the Amigo program through BMC support, which I'll talk about when we wrap up this session today. Okay, so let's talk about operating system compatibility. We've added some operating systems and dropped some operating systems that we support. I'm not going to read through every one of these. You guys can read this. There's a couple of reasons I put these slides together. This is, by the way, all in the documentation, obviously, but I put the slides together because it gives you one place to go look quickly and easily and not have to search across so many different components in the docs. It's a good quick view of what is in the docs so that you can find easily and read very quickly and easily. The other thing I wanted to do was talk about a few things here. So you're going to notice kind of a theme across all these different components. We're supporting Windows 2016 as one of the you know, operating system versions that we've added for a lot of these different components. For many of them, we've also added 2012 R2. You'll notice also that for a number of the components, we have dropped support for Red Hat 7.0 and Red Hat 7.1. So when you look at the presentation server here from a Red Hat perspective, you're going to see that, you know, 7.1 and 7.0 are no longer supported. And we added support for 6.9. We had a number of customers that needed 6.9 support, and we added that. And when we use the term support here at BMC, what we're talking about is the fact that we have tested and certified these components on these platforms. And I'll talk a little bit more as we wrap up the system compatibility discussion of, you know, about, you know, if you have a version that's not, quote, in the list. A couple of other key things to look out for on this slide. If you're using the presentation server with Korean localization, okay, be aware that Windows is not supported. We're not supporting Korean localization on the Windows platform. These other three platforms, we do support Korean localization, okay? Another thing to pay attention to over here is that the Enterprise Edition for Windows, for these different operating systems here, if you're using the TEA agent, okay, on Windows, we require the Enterprise Edition for these platforms here. You can't use the standard edition if you're going to implement multiple scripts. So what we're talking about here is the TEA agent may be running multiple, a single TEA agent may be running multiple synthetic transaction scripts. And if you're doing that and you decide that you're going to use the Windows 7 or Windows 8.1 or 10 platform for that, you need to be using the Enterprise Edition of Windows there. The other ones don't really have a concern. For Silk Performer, which is the component that allows you to that basically allows you to create the recordings. It's a Borland component downloadable from our you know, solution site. If you're going to use the network emulation driver with that when you create a recording, okay, then you need to be on at least one of these other platforms. It's not supported on Windows 10 and Windows 2016, so be aware of that. The rest of the OS platform support for Silk Performer is basically the same as the ones that you see here, okay? And obviously you'll notice that the TEA agent and Silk Performer are only supported on Windows. We're not, it never has and does not support Linux or any other platform. The intent there and the reason behind that is almost all customers, you know, end user desktops and so forth, laptops and whatnot are running a Windows, you know, a desktop type system, and that's where the transactions are executed from, and that's where the synthetic TEA agent actually runs. We want it running in an environment that simulates or mimics the true end user platforms. Now, the AD agents, these are referred to as the app visibility agents in the product. I'm deliberately using some of the old terminology here called AD agent, just to keep everybody kind of in sync and understand what's going on here. We're talking about here the Java agent and the .NET agent that get loaded up into an application, so that maybe you've got a Java based application, a Java-based web application server that has, your business application in it, and you want to be able to monitor and analyze transaction response times that are processing through that application. Well, what we do is we have a Java agent that is loaded up in the application as a component of that application. There's not a bunch of, redesign and recoding of the application that has to be done. We're simply loading up this additional Java agent as a jar file into the app, and the only thing you have to really account for there is a little bit of additional heap for the application itself, and you have to tell the application to load it. Okay, these are the supported operating systems. We've added a few here. There's a few that have been removed. So just, be aware of that. I'm not going to read through all the details of this. Also, notice over here, this is not operating system support. These are the supported application platforms that the Java agent can be loaded up into for WebLogic, WebSphere, Tomcat, JBoss, and so forth. These have basically not changed much. Okay, so these are the quote-unquote supported application platforms that the Java agent can be loaded up into. And I wanted to throw this on the slide along with the operating system support as well, just to give you that quick one place to look and see this. Now for the .NET agent, same concept. We're loading up an agent into a .NET application. We now support Windows 2016, but notice that you have to be on the .NET framework of 4.6.2 in that type of an environment, and we're talking about IIS version 10.0 here. Okay, I'm not going to read through all the rest of this, but as you can see, this is the matrix of supported operating systems, IIS versions, and .NET framework versions that the .NET agent will work with. Okay. Now for EUM, or End User Experience Management, the Analyzer and Collector is supported on Red Hat 7.2 and 7.3 there, 64-bit. And you can see the other ones, platforms that are also supported there. And you'll notice that the EUM Cloud Probe is supported on these other platforms. It basically the same platforms, except a greater, wider, extensive set of operating system platforms that it's tested and fully certified and supported on. For ITDA, there's a similar theme here. We've added, Windows 2016 support. We're now supporting all the way up through Red Hat version 7.4 on it, and so forth. Okay, so that's a lot of discussion about what's in the docs. It's pretty easy to look up. Put it in one place for you to, to find there. There's some key points and recommendations we've got regarding operating system, compatibility and operating system choices. One thing we recommend is to try to standardize the operating system platform across all of the core TrueSight components, meaning the server components, the integration service nodes, all the, various core type components of the entire stack. The reason for this is if you can standardize across, let's say, Red Hat 7.3, and I'm not saying that's the best operating system, that's just an example, okay? If you can standardize there, then all of your operating system type support from the operating system admins can go through, one team and possibly one person that knows and understands what you're doing, and you're not having to depend on different operating system administrators in the environment to schedule things, to get things done, all that kind of stuff. It just makes it logistically easier, okay? And if you're knowledgeable yourself in that particular operating system platform as a TrueSight administrator, then all the better as well, okay? So the more you can standardize there, the better. A note on our published versions, the ones that I've just gone over and discussed, and then of course in the docs as well. When we talk about a supported version, what we're saying is that BMC has tested and certified that operating system platform, okay? Now, for minor releases, so for example, let's say Red Hat comes out with version 7.5 or whatever, okay, when they introduce a new minor release. We will generally work fine with minor releases. And we have a kind of an open policy, so to speak. We don't necessarily document this other than in discussions like this one. But we'll make a best effort to support minor releases that may not be listed in our product documentation. We're not just going to turn you away. Generally, we expect them to work fine. Okay. Now, certainly, if it's not supported, if it's not in the supported list, you're going to try to use an operating system version that's not in our supported list. We would recommend that you open a case on that for tracking purposes. We'd like to know that you're doing that. We'd like to keep track of that kind of thing. And it also gives kind of a check, because there are some scenarios where we know there will be a problem. Okay, and we'll let you know, hey, we can't support that because it's missing certain libraries, and you can't add those certain libraries for whatever reason, or hey, you may not want to do that. There's some security issues with that operating system version or whatever. Okay. Another thing that we strongly recommend is NTP, to ensure that the operating system timestamp on all of your servers is accurate. Okay, and not off. So you want to ensure that NTP is in place and functioning before the install. It's important. This is really very important for all time-sensitive type data. Okay, and then it's especially important for EUM data. So, for example, if the times are off between the cloud probe and the analyzer collector server components, you could get into a situation where you got gaps in data and you end up with a mess, okay? So definitely ensure across the entire stack, all the server components and, components that are doing data collection and whatnot, whether it's EUM or not, that you're leveraging NTP so that you're ensuring the time on all of your operating systems is accurate and up to date in a consistent manner. Ensure that required libraries for the operating systems are installed and ready before you actually start installing the product. And do things like, leverage the operating system utilities like yum check and so forth to validate and verify that you don't have a corrupted library and that kind of thing, okay? And our libraries, the required libraries are, well documented. The area where you need to really pay close attention to this, and you really should pay close attention to all the components with this, but the area where there's a lot of required libraries and so forth that you need to check off is in the infrastructure management portion of the stack, as well as the presentation server. Ensure that any database that is dependent on a component is available and configured appropriately before you install the component. These things are kind of like no-brainer points, but one of the things I see happen, and I recommend avoiding this, is connectivity issues. You may have the database stood up and running, maybe it's Oracle, and you're able to connect into the database and validate it from the Oracle server or from some other desktop machine in the environment, but you haven't checked the connectivity from, let's say, the TSOM server that you're getting ready to install. And you go try to install it and it fails because it can't connect to the database. Recommend that you check that connectivity, ensure that it's working before you try to install the product. It's not going to break anything if it's not available. You're just going to get an error, during the install and then have to go fix it. But it's those kinds of things that interrupt the flow and workflow processes of getting the installs done that can be very time consuming. They can actually cost you days because you may have to go back to the DBA team to get the listener configured appropriately or whatever for Oracle or whatever the database is that you're connecting to. Obviously ensure that OS user creation and all their rights are set up before you do the install in the operating system, and that would apply to all the components, and there's quite a bit of flexibility and capability there. So for example, with the patrol agents, you can get a patrol agent to run as a, quote, no password logon user in a Unix or Red Hat Linux environment, or even SUSE, if you configure it appropriately. So think about, whether or not you're going to leverage some of those kinds of features and get that set up before you do the install. Don't try to rethink and redo things after the install. It's a lot easier if you plan ahead and execute appropriately. Also look for and pay attention to places where things like HTTPS might be required and where we don't support, for security reasons, HTTP. An example is the EUM Cloud Probe communication to the collector in the EUM portion of the stack. And obviously this is not any and everything to look out for. We would spend, quite a bit of time, more than what this session would allow, to go through everything. So strongly recommend that you review documentation for additional capability and, things like supported Java versions, web browser versions where we may not have called that out, support for different LDAP servers. Go look at the Remedy single sign-on, supported versions of LDAP and so forth before you start installing the product. Okay, so now let's talk quickly about some dropped features that you should be aware of. When we talk about dropped features here, this doesn't mean, oh, that's it, you got this installed and we're not going to support it all anymore, okay? Each one of the components and features that we drop over time are supported, especially if it's a kind of like a standalone component. It's going to be continued to support. We will continue to support it after we drop delivering it with a particular release. So a good example here is the BMC Impact Database Gateway. I don't think that we have, quote, completely sunset that yet. We're just not delivering it as an installable, usable component of the product anymore. But if you have it already installed, and I know there's some customers that do, and you're still leveraging it, there's no problem with you continuing to leverage it and use it, okay? It's just not part of the TrueSight 10.11 component feature release. And it doesn't mean that you can't take an event management cell with TrueSight Operations Management 11 and get it to forward data in the form of events over to the Impact Database Gateway. That's still going to work, okay? We're just not delivering this as a component anymore, and it will eventually be sunset. Okay, and we have ways of there's other mechanisms for getting events out of the cells into a database. For example, I've got a number of customers who are leveraging the reporting engine component to just forward events over to a database and store them in a database. It's very much the same concept as using the Impact Database Gateway. I'm not going to read through every single one of these. I'm just going to point out some of the key ones. The Windows event log adapters that were delivered with the event management cells, those are no longer being delivered, okay? We have other ways of monitoring Windows event logs. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to use those event log adapters for Windows event logs, and we can monitor them using the Windows Server, monitoring knowledge module in Patrol. And by doing that, we're bringing all the data together. You're able to deploy the agents and the knowledge modules through the TrueSight stack and not have to do, some kind of external deployment of the adapters for the event cells using some other, either something like our BMC server automation or Blade Logic product or some other third-party product to push those kinds of things out. We can deploy that monitoring. If you're using the KMs to do the monitoring, you can deploy that monitoring quite easily through the TrueSight stack without even having to deal with a server automation team to get your components and so forth deployed on the managed node for monitoring. The event cell KB migration utility, the GUI utility, has been dropped. are still continuing to support that from a CLI perspective. Not all customers necessarily use it when they do an upgrade or a migration. You can also back up your custom event cell, what we call MRL code, which is maybe some custom code that you've created for event processing, and or custom event data class content and whatnot. That can be easily backed up and reapplied. So you don't require this migration utility. And in fact, in most environments that I've worked with in helping them do a migration or upgrade, we just back up their custom configuration and then reapply it immediately after the install or upgrade of the old product. The admin cell, that would be like the status tab view in the old BMC event management environment, that has been dropped. A few other things have been dropped here. One key thing to keep in mind here is that the -I argument that you could pass on the event cell CLI commands has been removed. So that function doesn't execute anymore there. Triage and remediation workflows have also been taken out of the product. Those triage and remediation workflows had some benefit, okay, but none of them really were completely ready to go out of the box for any particular customer environment, because customers have different needs and so forth. There's quite a bit of configuration around that kind of thing, and so there's not a whole lot of value in us continuing to maintain that and deliver that as out of the box workflows, because they have to be adjusted for almost every customer anyway, and from one customer to another, the needs are different and whatnot. Okay, so moving on here, let's talk about installation and upgrade, go through some key points on that. And again, this is not focused on how to completely do an install and an upgrade. It's focused on what's new in TrueSight 11 regarding installation and upgrade. Direct upgrade from ProActiveNet or TrueSight Infrastructure Management version 9600.02, that patch level is now supported. So you don't have to upgrade to version 10 and then upgrade from that to maybe version 7 and then be able to upgrade to 11. You can go directly from this version of ProActiveNet or TrueSight Infrastructure Management Server to version 11. Okay, be sure to account for any customizations there, and this would apply to any upgrade as well, or migration. And I'm pointing this out because you may have a ProActiveNet and server out there that's in part of your older environment that you're upgrading into a TrueSight 11 stack that you might have stood up. Okay, so keep in mind, the event cell MRL code and custom data class content, either manually handle that or use a migration CLI there. SSL certificates, as part of your upgrade, you may be also implementing, security communications between the different components. We're seeing a whole lot of that across almost all of our customers due to security breaches and so forth that we keep hearing about in the industry. And then, of course, monitoring policies. So if you have some monitoring policies configured and so forth, take those into account as well. App Visibility Agent installation utility has been improved, and obviously it supports install, upgrade, uninstall, and silent install for the Java agents that are part of the App Visibility portion of the stack. Not going to go into a bunch of detail on that there. Now, there's a recommended general order of installation. Some of this must be followed in a specific order. Some of it is very flexible, and it really hasn't changed. The only thing that's really changed here is, obviously, we're using Remedy SSO, and we're not using Atrium SSO anymore. So it must be installed first before you do an installation of TrueSight 11, or if you're doing an upgrade from a previous release, that thing must be installed first. Second, we'd recommend you installing the presentation server, then the infrastructure management servers, then the infrastructure management integration service nodes. Then from there, you get to install the app visibility server, then start deploying the various agents. These may be patrol agents, they may be the AD agents, they may be the TEA agents for synthetic monitoring and whatnot. Okay. Then next would be ITDA components. One reason for installing ITDA components after the rest of this is you might have decided to leverage patrol agents for ITDA-related data collection. Okay, and obviously if you're going to do that, you need those agents out there. But it doesn't mean that you can't install the ITDA server components and integrate them to the presentation server before you do the rest of this. So there's a whole lot of flexibility here in what you install, first and so forth. And what dependencies there are and those kinds of things. The main thing is that you've really got to have the authentication mechanism installed first, and you really should have the presentation server installed. But you could be installing the presentation server, just running the install process for that at the same time that you're running the install process for infrastructure management servers. Okay, you just can't integrate the infrastructure management servers and really do anything with them until the presentation server is installed and configured and stood up, and then you log into it and add the integrations. Add the infrastructure management server and its pieces, its integration service nodes as well. You add them through the presentation server as components. And the same applies to all the rest of this as well, as far as adding these different major components into the presentation server. Okay, so that's the general recommended order of install, and we really haven't changed that. Let's talk about some data monitoring enhancements here. There's an in-context cross-launch capability that's been added where you can basically set up your own URLs to do a cross-launch from an event into an external component. It may be an external BMC product separate from TrueSight Operations Management, like MyIT or something like that, or it could be your own homegrown application or some other third-party application. Okay, some key things to note on this is that it applies when you were setting up these cross-launch URLs. They apply to a single tenant, so each tenant has their own. Okay, they are dynamic, meaning we will take event data and pass it to the other system through the URL configuration. Now, I'm not going through, how to configure these URLs. There's a very good discussion on that in the documentation, and there's even a video. It's about a 10-minute video or so that you can watch that explains how to set that up. Okay, but it's quite easy. It's very intuitive, and I think you're going to like it if you're going to use this feature. It supports HTTP and HTTPS only. Okay. Also, be aware that for you to have the ability to delete a particular cross-launch URL that you've configured or that has been configured, you have to either be the user who created it, okay, or if you're an admin for the same tenant, then you could delete it, or if you're an admin for the quote, asterisk or wildcard for all tenants. And I'm going to make a note here on Remedy SSO that I probably should have mentioned earlier. If you remember in older versions of TrueSight, TrueSight 7, 5, and so forth, 10.7, 10.5 that is, we had a quote-unquote BMC realm that was an out-of-the-box tenant realm in Atrium SSO, and we leveraged that, out of the box with the install of the presentation server and so forth. Okay, that realm doesn't really exist anymore unless you manually create it. In Remedy SSO, it's been replaced with a wildcard or an asterisk here that represents basically any realm, or any tenant is the right way to describe it. Okay. Now, some do's and don'ts for this data monitoring enhancement regarding, cross-launch. Definitely test and verify in development. Don't try to implement this right out of the box in production. You may, and the reason I mention this is you may upgrade from an older version of TrueSight and say, hey, I want to start using this feature now, and just start, configuring it in production. That could have adverse implications, not because of the product, but you got to keep in mind that you're, interacting with an external system. What is your URL request going to do, the cross-launch request going to do in the external system? What does that mean from a user perspective? How are the users going to leverage it? How many users might leverage it, okay? You need to think through these things and the cascading impacts of turning on these types of additional new capabilities, not just from a technology perspective, but from a workflow perspective, and what does it mean to the other application that may not have been responding to these URL requests in the past. Also, definitely name these cross-launch URLs carefully. Give them an appropriately and clearly defined name so that when users are going to pick one of them in the event processing portion of the console, they know what they're actually going to cross-launch into. Use very descriptive names and so forth there. Don't forget about things like security. Does the application you're cross-launching into require HTTPS? And we do support that, okay? What about user authentication? What about network connectivity, okay? Is a user who's in the presentation server on their desktop, are they going to be able to launch in context across the network from their location to this application that you've set up the URL for, okay? Think through those things before you start implementing it, even testing it in development and so forth. And don't create unnecessary configurations. Sometimes we introduce features that are like, wow, that's really cool, I'm going to turn that on for everything, okay? I've seen people, do that, and they're trying to do the right thing. I've seen that done for probable cause analysis and baselining and predictive alarming, especially, where some folks have thought the product is a whole lot smarter than it really is. Okay, and it's great. The product is very smart, but it's not God. Okay, so you don't necessarily want to do things like turn on predictive alarming for every single application parameter or whatever that you're monitoring. There's certain ones where it makes sense, and there's others where it doesn't make sense. And there may be certain scenarios where it really does make sense to cross-launch into another application, and other scenarios where it just really doesn't, So don't use a new feature for any and every, possible scenario. Think about where it's really going to provide you benefit, automation, and business benefit, and so forth. There's new self-monitoring that's been added. It's KM-based. The components that it covers is all of these major components that you see listed here, okay? Not going to go through all the details on that. I urge you, though, to go look at the details on this KM and start using these KMs, okay? There's quite a bit of benefit here in using them. And think in terms of, hey, maybe I'm upgrading an older TrueSight environment. There's these new features that I'm going to start using and introducing to my end users who log into the console. That could have an impact of, a lot more users logging into the presentation server. It really would be a good idea for me to be monitoring the presentation server, because it's going to have to respond to all those additional users and requests, and I really don't know what the load's going to be like, so I better start monitoring that if I'm not already monitoring it, okay? I urge you to think in terms like that. Definitely deploy and leverage at the time of initial install or upgrade, Configure event workflows where you generate events from the self-monitoring. Configure those event workflows so that they go to the TrueSight admins. You don't necessarily need to have all of those events necessarily go to the service desk or incident management. Maybe you do. Maybe you make it a business decision that you're going to do that, but ensure that they're flowing to the right people. Okay, there may be certain things that you might want to look for an alarm off of from a TrueSight perspective, and send those alarms and notifications only to the TrueSight admins through a notification and not even cut a ticket for it. You have to decide, how you're going to do those kinds of things and whatnot. The idea here that I'm trying to point out is that, A, get the information to the right people. and get it to them directly instead of having to go through multiple, groups and so forth of people that are just going to do nothing more than forward it on to the right people. And then in addition to that, there may be certain things that you want to be alarmed on, but you don't want to set off a bunch of bells and whistles and alarms to the rest of the the IT admins and so forth. It's just certain things that you might want to be looking out for in the environment that don't necessarily require an incident management process. Configure thresholds based on your environment. Okay, there's not a bunch of magic to this that we can implement out of the box. There's certain things that we do automatically out of the box and configure out of the box there. But you've got to think about what's the load going to be like on my presentation server or whatever other servers, and do I even know what that's going to be yet? Set your thresholds according to your environment. Don't necessarily expect the solution to auto determine what that's going to be for you, other than leveraging baselines and triggering alarms off of being out of baseline for some period of time and whatnot. And please don't ignore this capability. Really urge you to start implementing, if you're not already doing it, these self-monitoring knowledge modules and keeping track of things like heap utilization, keeping track of things like, certainly disk drive space, memory utilization, even outside of heap and all that kind of stuff for these different components. There's been some KM solution updates in the new 11.0 repository. Microsoft Windows servers has been updated, AIX, of course, self-monitoring that I talked about. There's an Intuity server knowledge module that's been updated there, and Apache Tomcat and the generic server, web server monitoring knowledge module. Okay, there may be some more. These are the ones that are listed in our documentation, and we're always updating these. We have releases coming out, interim releases of the repository come out before we have a new major release of TrueSight come out. So definitely keep your repository up to date there. Okay, so there's new capabilities around license usage report. This is more based on consumption. We're going to go through some things on this quickly here. Events. So there's an event report that lists the quantity of internal and external events per tenant and per TSOM server, and also based on event class. And you also can generate that report based on a selected period of time. Now you're going to notice a theme through all these reports where you can pick a selected period of time for these consumption reports. Okay. For the event reports, the tip here to pay attention to is that some quantities could contain internal and external events. Okay. So the report will list a quantity of internal and external events independently. Okay, be advised that it's technically possible, depending on how your event classes and event processing and generation is configured, that you could have some events that were really external events populated into, quote, what we think of as an internal event class. Okay, so just be aware of that. Depends on your configuration. It's not something that we have complete control over there. There's a performance data consumption report. It lists quantities of each one of these items here per tenant and TSOM server for a selected period of time again. So how many patrol agents, how many monitor types, how many instances of monitor types, and how many data streams. You're going to see this term data streams in some of the other reports. In the context of performance data, we're talking about performance data streams, such as parameters that are streaming data up to the TrueSight stack, the TrueSight servers. Okay. Certain monitor types are excluded from the data stream quantity. I didn't provide that list here. It's in the documentation. It's a fairly large list. Okay, so please see that documentation. The ones that are excluded are also listed in the report that you run, meaning you'll see a list of ones that are not included in the total quantity of data streams that are calculated in the report. The performance data report also includes a detailed report. Please go take a look at what's in that detailed report. The intention here is not to go through any and every new capability in every, component and so forth. We'd run out of time on that. If we try to address every single feature and so forth that's new in the product in this session. So it's more of an overview and introduction in some of these areas. Okay, IT data analytics, there's a consumption data report for that. It shows the quantities for each one of these items here. Okay, for each IT data analytics server, and that's per tenant, and again for a selected period of time that you choose when you run the report. Okay, so you'll see number of messages generated. That's total number of messages generated over that period of time. Data streams is presented as a maximum number of data collectors in any one single day during that time period. So it's like a high water mark for the data streams. And again, that's data collectors. A data stream corresponds to a data collector in ITDA from this reporting perspective. The names of each data collector that is considered in the license pricing structure is included, okay? And the number of messages that each data collector generated is also included in the report, okay? From an app visibility perspective, meaning that what used to be called the AD agents, that's the Java agent and the .NET agent that we talked about earlier, okay? A report can be generated that shows the quantities for each one of these items here, again, per tenant and app visibility portal instance, and again, for a selected period of time. So you're picking, the selected period of time that you care about on most of these reports here. We're showing, again, a high watermark or a maximum, high count of AD agents that were utilized during that time period. It's not the sum, it's the highest number that were executed and used during that period. A high count also of applications that were utilized during that period of time. Applications meaning applications as you would see in the presentation server, and the total number of events associated with the AD agents that were generated during that time period. Same general concept for the synthetic monitoring or TE agents. You've got a high count for TE agents that were utilized, high count of applications, and also a high count of data streams in the scenario. Data streams in this report for the TEA agent utilization and consumption is based on a unique combination of execution plan, transaction location, and a specific metric. So all of that combined constitutes one single data stream in this report. Configuration items, we simply provide a list of maximum, we list basically the maximum quantity of CIs that were configured during the time period that was selected per tenant and TSOM server, okay? So some do's and don'ts regarding this license usage reporting. Definitely pay attention to the time frames. Okay, so don't, if you're going to run a report and gain some knowledge about license utilization and so forth across the stack, you're definitely going to want to run that for the same time frame for all of the different reports that you may be running. Otherwise, you may have skewed data from a timing perspective there. Pretty obvious, but just, something to pay attention to. Also, we recommend that you have a secondary separate method to verify accuracy for licensing validation where possible. Okay, this isn't going to apply to every single scenario and situation. I'll explain why I'm, throwing this on the slide here in a moment down here in the do not stuff. But basically where possible, so for example, machines with patrol agents on them. And leverage, you may already be doing something like this. Leverage BMC server automation. I misspelled that. It should be server automation, not service automation. Or if you're using some kind of third-party product for auditing and you know, those kinds of things to determine what you've got deployed out in the actual environment. We'd recommend that you don't necessarily stop using that. Use that as a validation mechanism. And ensure, ultimately, you want to ensure that you're relying on accurate or at least defendable data for your reporting. Defendable meaning, hey, here's what I did, this makes sense, here's how I got the data, okay? Some things not to do: don't assume that reports accurately account for quantities that TrueSight Operations Management cannot determine the accuracy of, okay? So these reports only know what they know. They don't know scenarios like you may have agents and or monitors that you're planning to decommission that shouldn't be in a report, but they show up in the report because you haven't actually decommissioned them yet, okay? The reverse of that could be true. You may have agents and or monitors that are disconnected for some kind of reason, but you're still intending to use them for monitoring, but they're not showing up in the report because they've been disconnected and don't appear in the system anymore. Okay, but you expect to reconnect them at some point in time. So again, it's like any other technology. It only knows what it knows. It may not know other things that you have planned or actions that you have taken. Another example is you may have some legacy patrol agents in your environment that are not able to report into the TrueSight stack because the versions are so old, and they're old because they have to be that particular version because they're running on an old operating system. And there's still some customers out there, I think, that have a few application servers that are running on platforms like Windows 2000, okay? And our agent may not, you know, the agent that's deployed there is not able to report into the newer TrueSight stack, and you're not able to upgrade the agent because you can't upgrade the operating system, because you can't upgrade the application, kind of thing, okay? These reports may not take those kinds of things into account. They won't, okay? So be on the lookout for any, you know, significant scenarios like that. The reports are accurate from the perspective of what they are able to gather and know, but they can't know everything, right? So look out for scenarios that may skew the data to some extent here. And also consider things like multiple patrol agents on a single machine and what that might mean from a device count and how those agents are configured from a perspective of reporting in as a, quote, device. Okay, so just, you know, be aware of those kinds of things and so forth. There's been some security updates. Let's go through those quickly here. Last logon time has been added so that you can, when you log on as a user in the presentation server, you can see when your last logon was. That's kind of nice because if somebody else logged on as you'll be like, wait a minute, I didn't log on yesterday. Why is this showing up as me having logged on yesterday? That doesn't make sense, you know. That's why it's a security kind of capability that we've added here. Users can change their own passwords to the presentation server console as well. This only applies to quote-unquote local users that are configured in Remedy SSO. It does not apply to user accounts that are managed through LDAP, SAML, AD users, that kind of thing, okay? We'd recommend that you use a limited number of local users, and I actually recommend that you do use some local users. So create a backup admin user that's a local user defined in Remedy SSO, okay? And maybe some other, you know, local users for backup purposes as well, like for, you know, your operations team and so forth, so that they can log on. This is in case there's some kind of a problem with connectivity to LDAP or whatever, okay? If you have an account that gets locked out, or you having a problem with LDAP and whatnot, having these backup user accounts available for people to continue doing their jobs is rather nice. And it also certainly gives the admin the ability to get into the system in case the admin account that you might leverage through LDAP gets corrupted or locked out or something like that. Logon has been changed a little bit here. Users provide a tenant domain, so you must provide a tenant domain. If there is only one tenant user, if there's only one tenant set up in the system, users are presented the remedy SSO logon page. That may be a little bit confusing when you first start using this. So when you first use TrueSight 11 and you see this behavior, you might think, oh my gosh, there's something wrong here. There's actually not anything wrong. It's just that the behavior has been changed. So be aware of that. App visibility agent data confidentiality. It has been added. It is set up as policies in the product. Built-in policies cannot be deleted, so be aware of that. If you want to delete a non-built-in policy that is set up as the default policy or a default policy, you can create a new policy and set it to the default and then delete. This should not say out of box. I apologize for that. You can then delete the other policy, the non-built-in default policy. But basically, you can't delete the default policy if it's an out-of-the-box policy, because you cannot delete any out-of-box policies. Okay. And again, I apologize for this mistake here. And then secondly, if you have a non-built-in or non-out-of-box policy that you have set as default, you cannot delete it until you assign another policy as being the default. Okay? App Visibility Manager ciphers have been updated. An implication there is ciphers between the App Visibility server and agents must match, otherwise they won't communicate with each other. Okay? So if you're having agent connectivity issues, and again, App Visibility agents are that Java and or .NET agent that I talked about earlier. If you're having connectivity issues there with them, it could very well be a mismatched cipher related problem. And that's easily corrected. So, if you think that's the issue, please go look at the troubleshooting section in this area in our product documentation, and we take you through steps on how to correct that. Secure email to event has been added. So we've been able to consume events and process them as emails starting, I think, with 10.5 or 10.7, I can't remember which. And we've now added security for that, okay, over TLS or SSL. There's some limitations to this, so be aware of these limitations. Only the IMAP protocol is supported, and that would be IMAP protocol supported over TLS and or SSL. There is no proxy support in connecting to the email server with this. Okay, so we don't connect through a proxy with this. NTLM is not supported. User account must have read and write permission for the configured folder, so be aware of that. And email servers with HTTP access are not supported. So ultimately, we're not connecting over HTTP with this. It's IMAP over SSL or with SSL and TLS. The EUEM Cloud Probe Managed Decryption Key utility has been added. So this is a utility that helps you manage decryption keys. Okay, it copies decryption key certificate information to the Cloud Probe. It can run in two different modes. There's an interactive mode where you manually, enter commands as prompted through the utility, basically, or it can run in batch mode where you set up parameters and then it will automatically execute all those parameters and those instructions, let's call them, in a batch type manner. And so the tip here is to use a batch mode for situations that involve a lot of commands that you need to execute quickly, okay? This would be to avoid things like delays where you're entering, let's suppose you use the interactive command, okay, interactive mode capability. And you enter one command and then you get interrupted and then you come back and enter another command. And so there's these delays that would be introduced in the processing of the data while you're in the interactive mode versus the batch mode. The batch mode helps you, execute a bunch of actions, quickly in one batch and thereby reduce all these delays that would occur if you were in an interactive mode session. So we'll wrap up now with some usability improvements. Usability improvements include the ability to view event data annotations. Now, this is specifically data annotations regarding events, and specifically related to events generated in patrol at the patrol agent, where the patrol agent, created some annotated data associated with an event. That can be visualized now up in the presentation server. The default size of that entire data, chunk that you may be viewing is 4,000 characters, and it can be adjusted. You can also enable and disable this capability in the pronet.conf configuration of the TSOM servers. Here's the actual parameter or setting that you would configure. You would set it to true to enable this capability. It applies globally to any events that fall into this category for that one TSOM server that you set this up on. I don't go into how you increase the number of characters here. That's just another setting, and that is well documented. A tip, though, on this is avoid increasing to very, very large volumes of character sets, and also plan to monitor and possibly tune things like heap settings, for example, for the agent controller, because this is processed through the agent controller. If you expect large numbers of events with annotations like this and with large annotations, there's no way for us to anticipate the exact impact this may have in your particular environment. So we, again, strongly encourage you to enable and leverage the new KMs that we have provided from a self-monitoring perspective. And as you turn on new features like this, we'd recommend that you kind of wade into it. Don't just jump in and not monitor it. So it could, I'm not saying it will have an impact on performance, but if you turn on this capability and increase the character set to some very large number of characters, way, multiple orders of magnitude beyond the 4,000 here, and you have a whole lot of events that are being processed like this, then quite obviously you're processing more data, so you're going to have an impact on the system, and you need to be prepared for that. And the way to prepare for that is to ensure that you have monitoring in place and be, planning on doing some tuning if necessary. We've added the ability to view text parameters as well. So in Patrol, for many years, we've had various parameters that collect data and present it as text instead of a trended, data point and or an event. We capture data in the form of kind of a little report and present that as text in Patrol. That's now visible up in the presentation server, okay? It applies to text parameters from Patrol monitoring only. The data will appear on the monitor details page after selecting a parameter. So you're looking at, maybe you're looking at a parameter, you're looking at its trend, and you want to see this text information, then you could select multi-metric comparison on that page. And the data is queried basically through this obtain data patrol agent, data from patrol agent capability. You may have seen this in the product already in previous releases where you can say, I want to go obtain the data from the patrol agent kind of in a dynamic, immediate fashion, okay? That's how we're gathering this data from patrol to present it, and it's not configurable. And it's also not stored in the presentation server. The data is still actually, only stored at the agent. We're just making it visible and presentable up in the presentation server as needed. KM deployment status has been updated. That's under the area where you're looking at, devices, managed devices under configuration, where you would typically go and look at all the agents that are reporting into your integration service nodes and watch, things like KM deployment status and whatnot. The presentation server custom configuration has been improved here and enhanced. There's certain configuration files that we now support as overrides, okay? The CSR conf, index server configuration, database server configuration files. Basically what this means is those files where you want to, if you want to configure, custom configuration in your environment for those, they're stored under the custom directory on the presentation server, very similar to the way we handle custom configuration in configuration files for the TSOM server. That's now been applied to the presentation server. And you should not go in TrueSight 11 and future releases as well, you should not go and edit these files that are installed out of the box under the services directory for configuration. Instead, go to the custom directory and edit the corresponding files there for your tuning needs and so forth. There's a search capability for services that's been added. Not much to say about this. There's just a search capability where you can enter, information and click on search here to get a view of the services that you want to look at immediately. We've also enhanced the ability to configure CI types as services. So certain CIs you may have certain CI types that you want to show up as a, quote, service. In previous releases, only the business service type CI showed up as a service. You can now, pick and choose various different types of CIs in addition to that will appear as a service in the presentation server. It's limited to 20 different types, okay? And we have some best practices. I'll talk about that here in a moment. There's also the ability to customize the services page regarding the number of maximum services to display, how many services to display on a scroll. Do you want to display 200, only 100, whatever, okay? Services auto refresh rate as well, every 30 seconds, every minute, every 2 minutes, whatever is appropriate for you, okay? Okay, so some do's and don'ts on especially these services improvements and whatnot. Definitely monitor the TSOM stack. So again, keep hitting this over and over again, but I think it's very important that you start leveraging the self-monitoring and leveraging these KMs that we've provided. Plan to adjust tuning, especially if you increase data volumes significantly. So, by upgrading and then starting to take advantage of some of these newer capabilities, you could start impacting volumes of data that are being processed in a number of different areas. Number of services that are displayed is one. Okay, annotated data that I talked about earlier is another one. Number and types of CIs that are displayed as services. The ability to go and look at text parameters, usage reports. And it's not just from a technical perspective that these may have a cascading impact. Think in terms of, okay, there's new capability here that is available to users. And that may actually incite or cause additional users to start using the product that were not using it before. What's the impact of that going to be on your previously estimated and actual number of users that are logging into the product? Maybe previously you only had 50 or so users logging into the product, and now with these new features you may have 100 or more, because there's certain features that different teams may want to start taking advantage of. So as you start implementing the product and turning on new additional features that we've provided with TrueSight 11, you could have, obviously an additional impact to overhead and resources and so forth on the machines, and thereby need to add additional memory and so forth before you, make all these capabilities available to the user population. Don't enable features that you don't need. Just because something's kind of cool doesn't mean you necessarily have to or that you need to use it. Go back to your business needs. What do you really need to accomplish? And enable features that you need. Don't enable features that you don't need. Don't create additional overhead on the system. Don't create additional work on your part as a TrueSight administrator if it's something that's not truly needed or valuable to your environment. Don't enable features that you haven't tested. It may be tempting to upgrade in production to TrueSight 11 and then start enabling features because some things look really cool. Some of these features are going to going to get enabled out of the box, like the services search capability. You know, quite obviously, you're not going to enable or disable that really, okay? But some of these other major features that require some, you know, configuration, well, you definitely need to test those in development and understand them first before you start enabling them in production. And don't fail to plan for increased processing and data volumes like I've talked about here. Okay, so this pretty much wraps it up. Just a few last key points here. If you're not already aware, BMC has an Amigo program where we will help you do an upgrade and even implementation to an extent through BMC support. So how do you, join the Amigo program? How do you get help if you need it? Basically submit a ticket to BMC support and request this assistance through the Amigo program. Also, there's online documentation. Quite obviously, there's a link here for the Remedy SSO documentation and the TrueSight Operations Management 11 documentation. Its main link is the one listed there. And there's a lot of information on BMC communities as well. If you look at our documentation, which hopefully you are, you're going to see that we've started adding in the last year or so here quite a few places where we've got videos, how-to videos. And a lot of those how-to videos are also out on YouTube. So you can literally search on YouTube for certain how-to videos and information that we've published as well. And that's another source that you can use there. And with that, that's all I've got. I really appreciate you guys attending the session and or reviewing it after it's been recorded, and I'll turn it back over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Hudson. Thank you all for attending. As mentioned, this session will be recorded, including the Q&A session. Any questions in that Q&A session we have not been able to provide an answer for will be answered in the published version. This recording and the published Q&A will be available on our community's website in a few days after we've had the opportunity to collect the information and answer the questions properly. Do look forward to another invite for our next session happening in December. I hope you all have enjoyed the presentation and hope you have a great rest of your day and evening. Thank you for attending. Alex, I believe we're done with the presentation. If you would go ahead and close us out, please.
Thank you. That will conclude today's conference call. Thank you for your participation, ladies and gentlemen. You may now disconnect.